My garden gnomes weren't just decorations. They were my little ceramic family, symbols of the peace I cherished. So, when I found them smashed to pieces, pure fury was my first reaction. I was determined to find the petty vandal. But when I finally queued up my security footage, the image that flashed onto the screen made my blood run absolutely cold. The real crime I'd captured, it was infinitely worse. A dark secret that would completely unravel the meticulously crafted facade of the perfect neighbor who seemed to believe our street was her personal kingdom. My name is Chloe, and if you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said my life was delightfully, wonderfully unremarkable. I'm a freelance illustrator, which means my cozy little two-bedroom house in a sleepy, tree-lined suburb isn't just my home. It's my studio, my sanctuary. As a woman now firmly in my late 30s, I've grown to deeply appreciate the simple rhythm of a quiet life. And my garden? That's my ultimate happy place. I spend countless hours there, coaxing stubborn roses to bloom, tending to my small but determined vegetable patch, and yes, arranging and rearranging my beloved collection of garden gnomes. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, garden gnomes, really? But these weren't your average, blank-faced lawn ornaments. Each one was unique, handpicked. They had names, imagined personalities, intricate backstories I'd concocted during long hours at my drawing table. There was Professor Norman, always with his nose in a miniature book, Lyra, the musical gnome with a tiny lute, Sheldon, who looked perpetually startled, and Bartholomew, whose grumpy expression I found endearing. They were tiny, colorful sentinels standing guard over my flowers, and their cheerful presence never failed to make me smile. My work can be quite solitary, so these little bursts of whimsy in my yard were essential sparks for my creativity. My friends would often joke about my gnome army, but I didn't mind. They were part of my home's heart. Life was calm. My days revolved around strong coffee, the challenges of client briefs, the quiet company of my ginger cat, Marmalade, and the satisfying toil in my garden. Then Brenda arrived. The sold sign on old Mrs. Gable's house next door had barely come down when the moving vans rumbled up the street. I remember feeling a flutter of hopeful curiosity. A new neighbor could mean a new friend, perhaps someone else who appreciated quiet mornings and the scent of freshly cut grass. That hope, however, began to evaporate almost the instant I laid eyes on her. Brenda. She was orchestrating the movers with the imperious air of a field marshal, though her battlefield was a manicured lawn and her troops were just trying to unload a sofa. She was striking, in a severe sort of way, tall, clad in pristine, expensive athletic where that looked like it had never encountered actual exertion, and her blonde hair was coiffed into that aggressively sharp, asymmetrical bob that just screams, "I demand to speak to your superior." Large, dark sunglasses, the kind that obscure half your face, were perched on her head like a crown, despite the cloudy sky. A massive, instantly recognizable designer handbag was clutched in her manicured fist as if it contained state secrets. Her default expression was one of faint, pursed-lipped disapproval. I was out deadheading some pansies and offered what I hoped was a warm, welcoming wave and a cheerful, "Hi there. Welcome to the neighborhood." Brenda's head swiveled slowly. Her gaze, when it finally landed on me, was cool, analytical. Then, her eyes drifted assessingly over my vibrant, slightly wild garden, pausing with particular, undeniable disdain on Professor Norman and Lyra. "Oh," she finally uttered, her voice as flat and uninviting as a concrete slab. "So, you're the one with all that." She gestured vaguely with a perfectly nailed finger towards my gnomes before turning back to berate a mover about the precise angle of a lampshade. My face flushed. It wasn't outright aggression, but the condescension was palpable. My cherished, whimsical gnomes were reduced to all that. I tried to shrug it off. Moving days stress, perhaps. As someone who actively avoids unnecessary conflict, I resolved to just be polite, keep to my side of the property line, and assume we'd coexist peacefully, if distantly. I really should have known better. The initial weeks after Brenda settled in were marked by a series of minor, yet cumulative, irritations. Her recycling bins would often be left lingering at the curb for days post-collection, sometimes drifting into my driveway. She had a habit of engaging in very loud, very dramatic phone conversations in her backyard, always about some perceived slight or incompetence she'd encountered. I learned more about her feuds with department stores and utility companies than I ever wished to. Soon, the passive-aggressive jabs began, almost always aimed at my garden, my little oasis. One Saturday afternoon, I was meticulously weeding my lavender border when Brenda materialized at the low fence dividing our properties. Her nails, the color of blood oranges, tapped rhythmically on the wooden slats. "You know," she began, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. "An excess of ornamentation like this can really lower the aesthetic standard of a street. And it's just a magnet for, well, you know." She finished with a tight, insincere smile that didn't reach her eyes. I remember sitting back on my heels, dirt on my jeans, feeling a nettle of annoyance. "My gnomes, Brenda?" I asked, striving for a light, unbothered tone. "They're just for fun. They make me happy." "If you insist," she sniffed, every inch the suburban empress, before pivoting sharply and retreating into her impeccably modern, minimalist house, a stark, beige contrast to my colorful, slightly cluttered cottagecore vibe. I felt a genuine pang of anger. Who appointed her the arbiter of neighborhood aesthetics? But once again I swallowed my retort. She was just one opinionated person. However, the campaign of petty annoyances began to escalate. One crisp autumn morning, I found a folded piece of expensive, cream-colored stationery tucked into my mailbox, not delivered by the postman. It was an unsigned, typed friendly reminder that several leaves from my magnificent, mature maple tree had apparently drifted onto her pristine lawn, and that the overhanging branches, which had been there for 50 years, were now posing a potential hazard to her roofline and overall property value. The faint, cloying scent of Brenda's signature heavy floral perfume clung to the paper. Then there was the incident with Princess Fifi, her small, impeccably groomed white poodle, a dog that seemed to share its owner's perpetually disdainful expression. From my kitchen window, I saw Fifi trot onto my lawn, squat, and leave a rather unwelcome deposit right beside my award-winning sunflowers. Brenda was right there, scrolling idly on her phone, not 10 feet away. She saw it. She glanced at the mess, then directly at my window, a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk playing on her lips, as if challenging me. Then, she called Fifi and sauntered back inside. My hands clenched. I cleaned it up myself, the indignity stinging more than the task itself. Later that day, I attempted a polite conversation. "Brenda," I began, intercepting her as she collected a package from her porch, "about Fifi this morning on my lawn." She cut me off before I could finish, her eyebrows arching into those perfect crescents of incredulous offense. "Princess Fifi? What about her? She's a perfectly behaved animal." "Well, she relieved herself in my flower bed, and you were right there and didn't pick it up," I explained, struggling to keep the exasperation from my voice. Brenda actually let out a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, for heaven's sake. It's organic matter. I thought you garden types were all about that sort of thing. Honestly, some people are just looking for things to complain about." She then launched into a tirade about how my wind chimes, though muted, were disrupting her meditative peace. I walked away from that exchange feeling utterly defeated and increasingly incensed. It was like trying to reason with a beautifully presented cactus. The constant low-level stress was beginning to wear on me. My peaceful haven felt less peaceful every day. My gnomes, it seemed, became the silent lightning rods for her escalating disapproval. I'd catch her glaring at them from her perfectly clean windows, that judgmental frown etched deeply into her face. It sounds ridiculous, but I grew fiercely protective of these little plaster figures. They represented my defiance against her encroaching negativity. I even received a formal-looking letter from our homeowners association, citing an anonymous complaint about excessive lawn statuary creating visual clutter. There was no doubt in my mind who the anonymous complainant was. I defended my gnomes, thankfully providing photos that showed they were well within HOA guidelines for size and number, and the complaint was dismissed. I imagined Brenda's fury at that. The breaking point, the act that finally shattered my attempts at patient tolerance, came on a gray, drizzly Tuesday morning. I stepped outside with my first cup of coffee, anticipating the small comfort of seeing my gnomes' cheerful faces. Instead, the scene that greeted me made my breath catch in my throat, and the warm mug nearly slipped from my grasp. They were obliterated. Every single one. Professor Norman was in shards, his tiny spectacles nowhere to be found. Lyra's lute was smashed, her cheerful pose now one of tragic dismemberment. Bartholomew, fittingly, looked even angrier in his shattered state. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't kids playing too roughly. This was methodical, brutal destruction. The ceramic pieces were scattered like fallen soldiers. A tidal wave of heat washed over me, so potent it left me trembling. My vision narrowed. There was no note, no culprit in sight, but a cold, hard certainty settled in my gut. Brenda. It had to be Brenda. Who else harbored such venom for my innocent gnomes? Who else had been waging this silent, bizarre war of attrition against my simple joys? I felt a profound sense of violation. My sanctuary desecrated. I paced the damp grass, my mind a whirlwind of fury and frustration, trying to figure out my next move. The desire to storm over to her house, to unleash every bit of pent-up anger, was almost uncontrollable. But I knew, deep down, it would be useless. She'd deny everything with that infuriatingly smug look. Tears of helpless rage pricked at my eyelids. How could anyone derive pleasure from such mean-spirited, pointless destruction? Standing amidst the heartbreaking ruins of my gnome family, a cold, hard knot of fury settled deep in my stomach. This was beyond petty. This was a targeted act of aggression, a clear message that my happiness was an offense to her. And the image of Brenda's perfectly composed, judgmental face floated in my mind's eye. It was undoubtedly her. But the infuriating part was, how could I ever prove it? I felt a surge of despair. Was I supposed to just let this go? And then, like a forgotten life raft appearing in a stormy sea, I remembered. The security camera. Several weeks earlier, after a string of minor porch piracies in the neighborhood, I'd installed a discreet, motion-activated security camera. It was primarily aimed at my front porch and driveway, but its wide-angle lens also captured a significant portion of my front yard, including the very spot where my gnomes had held their cheerful, silent vigil. In the initial shock and anger, it had completely slipped my mind. My heart began to thump a hopeful rhythm against my ribs. Maybe, just maybe, I'd caught the gnome-destroying monster red-handed. I rushed back inside, my coffee growing cold and forgotten on the porch railing. My hands were shaking as I pulled up the camera's software on my laptop. I navigated to the recordings from the previous night, my eyes glued to the screen, scrolling through hours of inactivity, looking for that telltale flicker of movement around the time I imagined the attack had occurred, probably in the dead of night, under the cloak of darkness. I scrolled past the familiar sight of the paperboy on his early morning route, past a neighbor walking their dog before dawn, further and further back into the inky blackness. I was bracing myself to see a hooded figure, someone sneaking onto my property with malicious intent. What I saw instead made me suck in a sharp, incredulous breath. My hand instinctively flew to my mouth. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. The night vision footage was surprisingly clear, illuminated by the orange glow of the nearby streetlight. And there it was, Brenda's unmistakable, dark, luxury SUV. But it wasn't just cruising by. It was moving erratically, far too quickly for our quiet, narrow residential street. And then, with a sickening, metallic screech and a jarring crunch that was faintly audible even through the video's microphone, it sideswiped a parked car. Mr. Grantham's car. His meticulously maintained, classic sedan. Mr. Grantham, the kind, elderly widower from across the street, who treasured that vehicle, a final gift from his late wife. I watched, utterly transfixed, as Brenda's SUV jolted to a halt for a heartbeat. The driver's side window was down. Though her face was mostly in shadow within the vehicle, the silhouette of that distinctive, severe haircut was unmistakable. She paused, her head swiveling left, then right, a quick, furtive check for witnesses. And then, without a moment's hesitation, without getting out, without leaving so much as a note, she slammed the accelerator. The SUV lurched forward and sped off into the night, vanishing around the corner. My jaw had literally dropped. This wasn't just vandalism. This was a hit and run. A serious crime. My mind was reeling, trying to process the enormity of what I'd just witnessed. The Gnomes, for a moment, were forgotten. But the camera's recording hadn't stopped. Just a minute or two later, the footage showed Brenda's SUV pulling, with rather uncharacteristic haste and clumsiness, into her own driveway. The front passenger side of her vehicle, the side that would have borne the brunt of the impact with Mr. Grantham's car, was, infuriatingly, just out of my camera's direct line of sight, concealed by one of her deliberately overgrown privacy hedges. But then, the driver's door flew open. Brenda practically stumbled out. She looked undone. Her usually perfect hair was slightly askew, her movements jerky and agitated. This was not the cool, collected Brenda I was used to seeing. She slammed her car door with a violence that made me wince, then practically sprinted towards her front door. Her path took her directly past the edge of my garden, right by the spot where Professor Norman and his companions had stood. And then I saw it. In what could only be described as a sudden, explosive fit of sheer, unadulterated rage, or perhaps a desperate, misplaced lashing out from the panic and guilt of the accident she'd just caused and fled, she veered sharply towards them. The footage was chillingly clear. Her leg shot out in a vicious kick. Then another. And another. She didn't just topple them. She stomped on them, grinding their cheerful ceramic forms into dust beneath the heel of her expensive athletic shoe. It was brutal, ugly, and utterly senseless. And it was all there, captured in grainy, undeniable, time-stamped detail. She then straightened up, cast a quick, shifty glance around, completely oblivious to my discreetly positioned camera, and all but bolted into her house. I just sat there, staring at the screen, a maelstrom of emotions swirling within me. The raw anger about my gnomes was still present, a dull ache in my chest, but it was now dwarfed by a profound sense of shock and a strange, almost icy sense of vindication. The destruction of my gnomes hadn't been a carefully planned, targeted attack on me in the way I'd initially assumed. It was a petty, impulsive act of collateral damage, an outburst from a woman unraveling after committing a far more significant crime. She was so consumed by her own fear and fury from the hit and run that my poor, innocent gnomes became the unfortunate outlet for her toxic stress. I replayed the sequence, the hit and run, her panicked arrival home, the savage attack on the gnomes, several times. There was no room for doubt. My little security camera, purchased for porch pirates, had laid bare Brenda's hypocrisy. The self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood standards was a hit-and-run driver and a spiteful vandal. The irony was almost suffocating. My quest for what I thought was simple gnome justice had stumbled upon something infinitely more serious. With trembling fingers, I saved the critical footage to my hard drive, then immediately backed it up to secure cloud storage. My mind was already racing, a plan beginning to form. The first image that solidified in my mind was Mr. Grantham's kind, gentle face. He was such a dear old man, always ready with a friendly greeting or a piece of local history. That car, it wasn't just metal and paint to him, it was a repository of precious memories, a tangible link to his beloved late wife. The ugly gash and crumpled metal from Brenda's recklessness would be more than just an insurance hassle for him. It would be a genuine source of pain. My simmering anger towards Brenda now had a new, sharper focus. She wasn't just going to answer for my gnomes. She absolutely, positively was not going to get away with what she did to Mr. Grantham. My immediate instinct was to dial 911. But then I paused. I had the irrefutable proof, yes. But the thought of confronting Brenda directly, of watching her carefully constructed facade crumble when faced with her own actions, it felt vital. Not for my own gratification, well, maybe a little, but primarily for Mr. Grantham. He deserved to see her acknowledge her responsibility, to witness her entitlement shattered. The following morning, I walked across the quiet street. Mr. Grantham was already outside, his shoulders slumped, a look of profound sadness on his face as he gently ran a hand over the long, deep scrape and dent marring the otherwise pristine flank of his dark green classic sedan. "Oh, Chloe, my dear, just look at this," he said, his voice raspy with distress. "Happened sometime last night. Some reckless fool, I imagine. Didn't even possess the common decency to leave a note." My heart ached for his quiet sorrow. "Mr. Grantham," I began, my voice gentle but firm, "I am so terribly sorry this happened. It's truly awful, but I believe I know who is responsible, and I have proof." His faded blue eyes, usually so full of warmth, widened in astonishment. I explained about my security camera, the one I'd almost forgotten, and what it had inadvertently captured. I didn't play the footage for him right then and there on the sidewalk, but I described it in detail. As I recounted the sequence of Brenda's SUV hitting his car, her furtive pause, and then her cowardly escape, his initial sadness visibly transformed into a quiet, dignified anger. When I then told him about her subsequent, frenzied destruction of my gnomes, he simply shook his head slowly, a look of deep disappointment etching new lines around his mouth. "That woman," he murmured, his gaze distant. I must say, I always found her rather abrasive. So much judgment in her eyes. We spoke for some time, discussing how best to proceed. We knew we would involve the police. That was non-negotiable. But we both felt strongly that Brenda needed to be confronted directly first, in a setting where her usual tactics of denial and condescension would be less effective. We decided to wait until Saturday morning. Our street was always a hive of activity on Saturday mornings. Neighbors gardening, washing cars, children playing. We wanted witnesses. Not for public shaming, exactly, but to ensure Brenda couldn't subsequently twist the narrative or attempt to gaslight us. Saturday dawned bright and clear. I felt a tight knot of anticipation and nerves coiling in my stomach, but also a strong sense of righteous purpose. Mr. Grantham, though clearly still upset, was a pillar of calm resolve beside me. Around 10 o'clock, as if on cue, Brenda emerged from her house. She was dressed in immaculate white linen trousers and a vibrant turquoise silk blouse, her oversized sunglasses firmly in place, her phone already clamped to her ear in what appeared to be another of her typically animated, aggrieved conversations. She was heading towards her gleaming SUV, no doubt off to some exclusive brunch or high-end boutique. This was our moment. Mr. Grantham and I walked across the street, timing our approach to intercept her just as she reached her car door. As predicted, several neighbors were out. Mrs. Henderson was diligently weeding her rose bushes. The Peterson twins were giggling as they raced their scooters on the sidewalk. "Brenda, good morning. Could we have a moment of your time?" I asked, keeping my voice polite but unyielding. She lowered her phone with an irritated sigh, her perfectly shaped eyebrow arching in classic condescension. "I'm actually rather pressed for time," she said, her tone dismissive. "This shouldn't take long," Mr. Grantham interjected, his voice steady, though I could see the slight tremor in his hands. "It concerns my car." He made a small gesture towards his damaged vehicle, which was clearly visible from where we stood. Brenda spared it a cursory glance, then looked back at us, a fleeting, almost imperceptible flicker of something. Was it panic in her eyes before her expression hardened into a mask of blank innocence? "Your car? What about it? Has something untoward occurred?" "You know perfectly well what occurred, Brenda," I stated, taking a small step forward. "You struck it with your vehicle. On Thursday night, just before midnight. And then you fled the scene." A sudden silence fell over the nearby gardens. Mrs. Henderson paused, her gardening shears mid-snip, now looking over with keen interest. Brenda's face tightened, a faint flush rising on her cheeks. "I have absolutely no recollection of any such event. That is a preposterous and frankly insulting accusation. Perhaps one of these children," she waved a dismissive hand towards the Peterson twins, who had stopped their play to stare, "was being careless with their toys." My own temper flared at her shameless attempt to deflect blame onto innocent children. "No, Brenda," I said, my voice gaining an edge I didn't try to conceal. "It wasn't the children. It was you, in your dark SUV. We have it all comprehensively recorded on video." The color visibly drained from Brenda's face for a split second before her defensive ramparts slammed back into place. "Video? What video? Are you suggesting you've been illicitly filming me? That's an invasion of privacy. It's harassment." "It's my legally installed security camera footage, Brenda," I replied, my voice now cold as ice. "It very clearly shows your vehicle, identifiable by its license plate, striking Mr. Grantham's car. It shows you stopping, looking around to see if you were observed, and then deliberately speeding away without leaving any details or checking on the damage. In most places, that's defined as a hit and run, a criminal offense," Mr. Grantham added, his voice resonating with a quiet, unshakable authority. And my dear Chloe was also kind enough to share with me the footage from mere moments later. "It shows that immediately after fleeing the scene of the accident you caused, you proceeded to enter her property and vandalize her garden gnomes with considerable violence." By now, several other neighbors had gravitated closer, drawn by the unfolding drama. The usual weekend hum of lawnmowers and distant laughter was replaced by a captivated silence. Brenda's carefully constructed composure finally shattered. Her face contorted, becoming blotchy and red. "This is utterly ridiculous. You're conspiring against me. Those tacky gnomes were probably knocked over by a stray dog. Or a strong gust of wind." Her voice was rising, becoming shrill and unsteady. "And my car is perfectly fine. There's not a scratch on it. Look." She gestured wildly towards the driver's side of her SUV, which, from our current vantage point, did indeed appear undamaged. "The significant damage is to your front passenger side, Brenda," I clarified, my tone unwavering. "The side that made forceful contact with Mr. Grantham's sedan. The side that is conveniently obscured by your dense hedge when you park in your driveway. But the impact, the sound of crunching metal, your subsequent actions, it's all exceptionally clear on the video. Undeniable." You can't prove a thing," she stammered, but the bluster was rapidly deserting her. Her eyes darted frantically from me to Mr. Grantham, then to the ring of now openly staring neighbors, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and dawning disgust. She tried one last, desperate gambit, her voice cracking with a victimhood that no one was buying. "This is a coordinated neighborhood attack. You're all just jealous and can't stand that I uphold certain standards." It was Mrs. Henderson who spoke then, her voice, usually so gentle, now carrying a stern disapproval that cut through the air. "No, Brenda. We're not jealous. We just don't appreciate hit-and-run drivers who damage other people's property and then try to blame innocent children. And quite frankly, most of us are tired of your condescending attitude and your destruction of things that bring your neighbors a little bit of harmless joy. Brenda looked as though she'd been physically struck. Her mouth opened, then closed. She fumbled in her oversized handbag for her keys, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grasp them. She was no longer capable of meeting anyone's gaze. The imperious, judgmental queen of the cul-de-sac was gone, replaced by a visibly guilty, cornered, and utterly deflated woman. There were no more denials, no more haughty accusations. Just a thick, damning silence. Mr. Grantham, with quiet dignity, took out his mobile phone and calmly dialed the non-emergency police number. The satisfaction I felt in that moment wasn't a surge of vengeful glee. It was the deep, resonant hum of truth finally, irrevocably, coming to light. My poor, shattered gnomes, in their own absurd way, had become the tiny, unexpected keys that unlocked a much larger, uglier secret about our perfectly unpleasant neighbor. The arrival of the police was, for Brenda, the final act in her neighborhood reign of terror. They took detailed statements from Mr. Grantham and me, and I played the crucial video footage for them on my laptop right there in my living room. The officer who subsequently examined Brenda's SUV swiftly located the telltale scrapes and paint transfer on the passenger side, precisely where the video indicated the impact had occurred, cleverly hidden from casual view when she parked. Faced with the irrefutable digital evidence and the steely gaze of law enforcement, Brenda's remaining defenses apparently crumbled. She was charged with leaving the scene of an accident involving property damage. Her insurance company was less than thrilled, but had to cover the substantial costs of repairing Mr. Grantham's cherished classic car to its former glory. Socially, Brenda became an instant pariah. The disapproving whispers and cold shoulders that followed her whenever she dared to venture outside were palpable. Her immaculate lawn and minimalist house suddenly felt like a very lonely, very sterile fortress. It came as no surprise to anyone when, less than 3 months later, a for sale sign was hammered into her front yard. The collective sigh of relief from the neighborhood was almost audible. As for my gnomes, their untimely demise was not forgotten. In a heartwarming display of solidarity, several neighbors, led by a deeply grateful Mr. Grantham, pooled their resources and surprised me with a whole new, even more eclectic and whimsical assembly of garden guardians. Professor Norman II now sports even larger spectacles and carries a tiny scroll of ancient lore. Lyra II has a mandolin and what looks like a mischievous grin. My garden, once a scene of destruction, is now more vibrant and joyful than ever. Looking back on the whole bizarre episode, it's funny how a seemingly small injustice, the senseless smashing of some ceramic figures, can inadvertently unearth something so much more significant. I was initially just a heartbroken gnome enthusiast, consumed by a desire for petty revenge. But that act of vandalism, a mere footnote to Brenda's larger transgression, was the catalyst that exposed her true character and brought about a much more profound form of justice. Not just for my little garden friends, but for a kind, elderly neighbor who had been wronged. My little corner of the world feels peaceful again, imbued with a renewed sense of community. And I've learned that sometimes, even in the quietest suburbs, drama can unfold in the most unexpected ways, and that truth, much like a well-tended garden, will eventually find its way to the light.